There's a specific kind of tired that doesn't come from working too much. It's quieter than that. It sits somewhere behind your eyes, maybe, or in your chest, low down, like something that used to move and stop. You're not sad exactly. That's the strange part. Sadness has a shape to it. You can feel its edges, trace where it came from. This isn't that. This is more like flatness. Like someone turned the contrast down on everything and you didn't notice until one day you were standing in a room you used to love, or eating something that used to be your favorite, or talking to someone you genuinely care about, and there was just nothing behind it. Not nothing terrible, just nothing. You ate the food, you stayed in the conversation, you smiled probably, but you weren't quite there. And the part that's hard to explain, the part that makes it feel strange instead of just sad, is that there's no obvious reason. Nothing broke, nothing was taken. The life on the outside looks basically fine, maybe even good, and yet something somewhere went quiet in a way you can locate or name or fix, because you don't fully understand what it is yet. You're not burned out, you're not depressed, or maybe you are slightly, but not in the clinical way, not in the way anyone would recognize or treat, just in the way a lot of people seem to be right now, quietly, without talking about it, like the color in things drained out slowly while you weren't watching. I think about that a lot. What it actually means when excitement stops arriving, not because something went wrong, but because something got used up, worn down. Like a frequency you played too loud for too long, and now you need the volume louder, and even then it doesn't quite land the same way. Most of us don't stop to name it. We just reach for the phone. Think about the last time you genuinely looked forward to something. Not the performance of looking forward to it, not the telling people about it, not the posting about it, not the mental rehearsal of how it will go, actually felt it. That low warm pull in the body, the thing that makes Tuesday feel lighter because Saturday is coming. When did that last happen? I'm not asking to make you feel worse. I'm asking because I think a lot of us have stopped noticing the absence. We've adjusted to a version of life where mild anticipation is normal and genuine excitement is a surprise, and we've adjusted so gradually that we can't quite remember what it felt like before. You open your phone in the morning without deciding to. It just happens. Your thumb moves before you're awake enough to have made a choice. You scroll through things, you consume things, you put the phone down and pick it up again 4 minutes later. Not because something happened. Not because you're waiting for anything specific. Just because the silence of not scrolling feels somehow worse than the scrolling itself, even though the scrolling doesn't feel good either. That specific loop, I find it worth sitting with for a moment. You're not enjoying the scrolling. You've noticed that, but the absence of it feels uncomfortable enough that you keep doing it anyway. Which means you're not really doing it for pleasure. You're doing it to avoid something, or maybe to stay close to the possibility of something. Like if you keep looking, eventually something will arrive that finally feels like enough. It almost never does, and then hours pass. The ceiling is the same ceiling. Your jaw is slightly tense. It's been tense since you woke up, you just didn't notice. The room is the same temperature it's been all evening, and the light from the phone has been the only real light for a while now, and you're not tired enough to sleep and not awake enough to do anything. And somewhere in that in between space, there's this low hum of dissatisfaction. Not dramatic, not devastating. Just this. Nothing felt like quite enough today. It didn't feel like enough yesterday either, or the day before, and the strange thing, the thing that makes this particular feeling different from ordinary unhappiness, is that you've had access to more stimulation today than any human being in history would have thought imaginable. More content, more information, more entertainment, more ways to be briefly interested in something, more everything, and still, that quiet flatness. Long before any of this existed, someone was trying to understand exactly this feeling. Not the phone version of it, but the structure underneath it. The way people can be surrounded by things and still feel somehow empty. The way having more doesn't seem to produce the feeling that more is supposed to produce. He noticed that the problem wasn't a lack of things to feel excited about. The problem was something that happened to the feeling itself. There's a difference between wanting something and consuming something. It sounds obvious when you say it like that, but I think it's easy to lose track of in practice, to confuse the two so completely that you stop noticing the difference at all. Wanting something has a quality of reaching to it. There's a gap between you and the thing, and the gap matters. It's where the anticipation lives, it's where the imagination does its work, building the thing up, filling it with meaning, making it matter before it arrives. That gap is uncomfortable sometimes. Longing is uncomfortable, but there's something alive in it. Consuming something is different. The gap closes immediately. You wanted it, you have it, you move to the next thing. And the speed of that, the immediacy of it, starts to erode something slowly if you do it enough times. I think what gets eroded is the capacity to want deeply, not completely, it doesn't disappear, but it atrophies in the way anything atrophies when you stop using the right part of it. The muscle that waits, that sits with longing, that tolerates the gap between wanting and having, that muscle gets weak. And when it gets weak, things that should feel exciting just feel briefly interesting and then gone. Someone once wrote about two ways of being in the world, not as a philosophical exercise, as a genuine diagnosis of something he watched happening to people around him. One way, you measure your life by what you accumulate: things, experiences, achievements, entertainment, followers, approval, whatever the currency is. You are functionally the sum of what you've collected. And the feeling that comes from this is never quite stable because things can always be lost and enough is never quite enough. And the next thing always looks like it might be the one that finally fills the space. The other way is harder to describe because we don't really have good language for it in the modern world. It's less about what you have and more about what you actually are, how present you are, how genuinely you engage, whether what you do comes from somewhere real in you or whether you're going through motions. He wasn't being moralistic about it. He wasn't saying one was good and one was bad in some religious sense. He was making an observation about what each mode does to a person emotionally over time. When you live primarily in the first mode, accumulating, consuming, collecting stimulation, something happens to your relationship with your own desire. You start wanting things without knowing why you want them. You reach for things without having chosen to reach. And crucially, nothing satisfies for long because satisfaction isn't really the point anymore. The point is the movement, the consumption, the ongoing proof that you're still engaged, still stimulated, still here. And somewhere in that, the actual feeling of excitement, real excitement, the kind that comes from genuinely wanting something specific, something that means something to you, starts to get harder to access. It doesn't leave loudly, it just gradually gets quieter. Until one day you're lying in a room full of options and nothing sounds right, and you can't figure out if you're tired or bored or sad or just somewhere the feeling should be but isn't. I want to stay with that moment for a second. That specific moment of standing in front of all the options. You've been there. The streaming queue with hundreds of things to watch, the saved playlists, the folders of screenshots of things that looked interesting, the mental list of books you meant to read, hobbies you meant to start, things that seemed exciting when you bookmarked them and just feel like, wait, now. There's a specific kind of exhaustion in standing in front of too many doors. It's not the exhaustion of working hard, it's more like the exhaustion of having searched for a long time without finding the right thing. And the strange part is that the searching itself starts to feel like it might be the problem. Not that there's nothing good behind the doors, but that something about how you've been looking has made the looking feel wrong. You start a video, watch 3 minutes, leave. Start a song, skip after 30 seconds. Open a book, read 2 pages, set it down. Not because any of those things were bad, just because nothing quite breaks through. Nothing creates the feeling you went looking for. And maybe here's where it gets uncomfortable. Maybe you went looking for a feeling you haven't been able to clearly identify in a while. Because what would genuine excitement actually feel like right now? Can you picture it? Can you remember in your body what it feels like when something genuinely grips you? When you forget to check your phone for 2 hours? because you're inside something real. For some people, that memory is surprisingly far away. There's something Byung-Chul Han wrote about, not exactly this, but close enough that it feels relevant, about how the flood of stimulation doesn't enrich attention, it fragments it. You train yourself without meaning to receive things in smaller and smaller pieces. The long article becomes the headline, the film becomes the clip, the conversation becomes the reaction. And the emotional depth that requires sustained attention, that requires you to stay inside something long enough for it to matter, that depth becomes harder to reach. Not because you're broken, because you've been living in an environment that rewards brevity and punishes stillness. Every time you felt a moment of boredom and immediately resolved it with your phone, you trained something. Every time you let a video autoplay, instead of choosing the next one, you let someone else decide what you wanted. Every time you scrolled through something without really engaging and felt vaguely unsatisfied at the end, each of those moments left a small residue, and the residue is this. You started to associate wanting with an itch, to be scratched rather than a pull towards something real. That's different. That's a fundamentally different relationship with desire. And I think, though I'm not certain about this, I'm still working it out. I think that's what's underneath a lot of the flatness. Not that there's nothing to be excited about, not that life has genuinely emptied of meaning, but that the machinery through which excitement normally arrives has been quietly rewired to produce something else, a simulation of interest, a reflex of reaching, something that looks like wanting from the outside but doesn't have the feeling in it. Late at night, the apartment gets very quiet. You know the specific quality of that quiet. Not peaceful exactly, more like refilled. Like the noise of the day was performing a kind of covering function, and now that it's gone, something underneath is more visible. Most people don't stay in that quiet. Not voluntarily. Within a few seconds, sometimes less, they've opened something, a video, a podcast, music, anything. Not because they chose a specific thing, just because the silence needed filling. I understand that. I do it too. But I've started to wonder what the silence was about to show me before I covered it, because I don't think it's nothing. I think the discomfort of silence is informative. It's not just emptiness, it's more like the feeling of suddenly being alone with yourself after a long time of not being alone with yourself and discovering that you're slightly uncomfortable in that company. Not because you're a bad person, not because something is wrong with your inner life, but because you've spent so long moving, consuming, filling, scrolling, reaching, that sitting still with yourself feels unfamiliar, like being in a room you used to know well and finding it slightly rearranged. Someone noticed this long before the phone existed. He said that people will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid the experience of being alone with themselves, not the circumstance of being alone, but the actual interior experience of it, the encounter with your own thoughts and feelings without the buffer of distraction. He thought this avoidance was one of the most revealing things about modern life, not because solitude is sacred, but because the inability to tolerate it tells you something about what's been lost. And what's been lost, he thought, was a relationship with yourself, not a mystical self, not a deep hidden self, just the ordinary ongoing experience of being the one inside your own life. Noticing what you actually feel, what you actually want, what actually matters to you when nobody is watching and nothing is performing. That experience requires stillness. It requires a certain willingness to let boredom arrive without immediately solving it. It requires tolerating the gap for a few minutes between yourself and the next stimulation. And most of us have made that gap so small it barely exists anymore. The warm blanket, the ceiling, the phone face down on the bed that you're going to pick up in approximately 4 minutes. What if you didn't? I'm not saying it as a challenge, more as a genuine question, the kind you sit with rather than answer. What if the flatness isn't a malfunction? What if it's more like a symptom? The way a body runs a fever not to destroy itself, but to signal something. And the signal is something in here is not being fed, not stimulation, not content, not another layer of interesting information, something quieter, something that can only grow in the absence of noise. The problem is, we've forgotten what that something even is. We've been away from it long enough that we're not sure we'd recognize it if we stopped. I think what we're actually hungry for, underneath all the scrolling, underneath all the reaching for the next thing, is a specific experience that's become genuinely rare. The experience of being fully inside a moment, not documenting it, not half thinking about something else while it happens, not consuming it. Actually, inside it with all of yourself present, the way children are sometimes present, embarrassingly, unselfconsciously present, where the thing they're doing is the whole world for those minutes. We remember that feeling, dimly maybe, or in specific flashes, a conversation that went on for 3 hours and somehow felt short. A film that left you sitting in the credits because you weren't ready to return. A morning walk where you forgot you were walking. A meal that you actually tasted. Those moments didn't require anything special, no particular event, no exceptional circumstance. They just required your full attention, undivided, and long enough that something real could accumulate. And I wonder if we've started to think of those moments as lucky accidents, rare gifts from the outside world, things that happen to you when the conditions are right. But maybe they were always also something you brought. A quality of presence that is actually something you can practice or lose, something that responds to how you spend your ordinary hours, whether you train yourself to stay inside things or whether you train yourself to skim across the surface of everything. There's a version of modern life that is incredibly wide and almost no depth at all. You know an enormous amount about many things, you've been briefly moved by thousands of moments, videos, articles, conversations, images, each one real in its own small way. But the movement didn't have long enough to go anywhere, it got replaced by the next thing, and the next, until movement became the default condition and stillness became the strange one, and depth, the feeling of being genuinely inside something, of something mattering enough to sit with, that started to feel almost exotic, something you have to make a special effort for, something slightly outside the normal rhythm of days. I'm not sure when that happened. I don't think there was a clear moment. It was gradual in the way most important things are gradual, arriving so slowly you don't notice until you're already inside it, and looking back feels like trying to see through fog. But I think the flatness, the nothing feels exciting anymore feeling, lives somewhere in there. Not because the world is less exciting, not because you've changed in some permanent way, but because excitement, real excitement, requires a certain amount of emptiness to grow in. Requires the gap, the waiting, the tolerating of wanting without immediately resolving it. Requires a self that is present enough to be genuinely moved rather than reflexively stimulated. And when every empty moment gets filled, when every gap gets closed before it can become longing, when every silence gets covered before it can become stillness, there's no room. No room for the thing that would actually feel like something. Montaigne, writing alone in his tower 400 years ago, not because I want to make this academic, just because it's a genuinely strange thing to think about, wrote that he retreated into himself not to escape the world, but to actually meet it from the inside, on his own terms. He thought that without that interior place, a person could be very busy and very surrounded, and still somehow not quite living their own life. I think about that phrase sometimes. Living your own life. What does it mean when the life is technically yours? Your choices, your days, your screen, your feed, but the experience of it feels somehow borrowed, assembled from other people's aesthetics and other people's desires, and an endless stream of things that other people decided you might want to feel. Maybe this isn't about fixing anything. Maybe that's the wrong frame entirely. The idea that something is broken and needs correcting, that there's a technique to recover excitement or a practice to follow or a realization that will restore the color if you understand it clearly enough. I've noticed that thinking in solutions makes this particular feeling worse. It makes it into a problem to solve rather than something to understand. And understanding is quieter than solving. It doesn't have the same urgency. It just asks you to look at something honestly for a little while. So, you feel flat or numb, or like the things that used to move you have gotten quieter and you can't tell if they changed or you did. And maybe, I'm not sure about this, I keep going back and forth. Maybe that's not the worst place to start from, not because suffering is valuable or any of that. Just because there's something specific about this particular feeling, it tends to arrive when a version of you that was running on borrowed fuel starts to run low. When the stimulation stops covering something that actually needed attention. The flatness might be the first honest signal in a while. Not a verdict, not a collapse, just your actual state revealed without the noise covering it. The phone is still there, the room is still dark. Your shoulders have probably been tense for longer than you realize. You don't have to do anything with any of this tonight. But somewhere in the act of noticing, really noticing, without immediately reaching for the solution or the next video or the scroll that covers the feeling back up, something small might shift, not fix, just slightly less alone in it. That's maybe enough for tonight.